My university and many others have what I think of as a fundamental moral problem, which is because of our tax-exempt status, we literally sit on perpetual money machines, right? If you can trade without capital gains taxes, you should be able to beat the market year in, year out. And what that means is that we're at the point now as a university where we do not serve enough students given the value of our endowment and the payout. So as an institution, we need to figure out how to do more for the world long term, and that problem's only going to grow. And as more universities develop really good endowment management organizations and the returns compound over time, they're going to be entering a similar situation. That's potentially a massive source for good for the world. And if you have these institutions that have resources to connect the latest and greatest research in many fields to practical applications, but they need to set up structures to do that. And historically, that wasn't so important, but as now, all the major universities have developed fundraising systems and are getting those endowment management teams together, they're all going to start to move into the space we're in where it is a moral imperative. Yeah. And so I think more universities do need to figure out how to leverage for the betterment of the world the insights that are being developed by their faculty. Some of that is going to be commercialization, but I think a lot of it will be things that are not commercial, but are bringing more quickly into the policy world the things that we're learning in research and education, public health, social sciences, et cetera.
Welcome again to Navigating Noise podcast. We're really delighted today to have Jake Shapiro join us. Jake is a professor of international affairs at Princeton University. He's the author of two books that I know of, Terrorist Dilemma early on, which was really informative, just something I was teaching at the University of Virginia at the time, as well as a book he co-authored with some others. Is it Big Data, Small Wars, or is it Small Wars, Big Data? I always forget which order it comes in. But anyway, welcome. Tell us a little bit about your background and actually the real title, what order the title comes in.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. So it's Small Wars, Big Data. And it's really about both the journey of scientific discovery in terms of using data to understand the kinds of wars the U.S. was involved in for most of my adult life, and also the story of what we learned about how these kinds of conflicts work. My background goes back to having been in the Navy after college and doing a PhD out at Stanford at a time when the U.S. was engaged in multiple small wars around the world and wanting to apply the social science graph to trying to think about those conflicts. And so created a number of organizations to try and address that, most importantly, the Empirical Studies of Conflict Project, which brought scholars from around the world together to try and use data and evidence to understand how the kinds of wars that the U.S. was fighting were working, and more generally, how to build peace and stability out of places that had fallen into disorder. Along the way, did field research in Afghanistan, Colombia, India, Pakistan, research on many more countries beyond that, and I spent a lot of time thinking about how we can use data to try and understand these really complex social phenomena where the uncertainty about the right policy choices and how we should engage is significant and largely based on the kinds of evidence we don't think is good enough in many areas of policy. And so trying to figure out how we can do better.
So there's tons of questions around that, but where are we most data poor with respect to this as understanding conflicts?
I think we're not data poor, we're applied research poor. And that's because the teams that you need to assemble to make the most of the kind of information we get in the world right now are kind of complicated. You need some people with subject matter knowledge. You need some people who understand how to turn that knowledge into scientific evidence. And then you need people who can work with the nuts and bolts of the data to turn it into the kinds of artifacts that people need to do the analysis. And we don't have a lot of places that we can assemble those kinds of teams and keep them on a problem for long enough that they can develop the rich understanding you need to generate really reliable science.
So who has done that? Do universities do that? That's not been really my experience at university. We work on 3 to 5 year grants a lot of times on projects.
Yeah, so some universities have built teams that either do the research or do the infrastructure. So, for example, ETH at Zurich has built a fantastic set of teams and data infrastructure for kind of global scale analysis of conflict and peace and security. And they've been able to do that on the backs of significant funding from the Swiss government. The ACLID team, Armed Conflict Location Event Data um, team, has done a phenomenal job of developing data resources that scholars around the world are using. And then the scale of the institutions those scholars have been able to create varies. Our approach at ESOC was to try to create the kinds of connections and networks that would allow many more scholars to learn the details of different conflicts, and then use those details to figure out how to understand in very reliable ways what was going on inside those conflicts and how they were working.
Yeah, ESOC referring to the empirical studies of conflict. Is that
Yeah,
right? Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah. So I guess to what extent is the data the same from conflict to conflict there? Like what we work in a lot of like particularized locations, and we're finding that there is very similar data, but it's a different value depending on the context there. And I'm just kind of wondering how you might do this in a cross-national or transnational perspective. Are you finding that there's a set of sources or types of data out there that is common, and those are all going to be similarly informative across all the conflicts?
It's definitely very conflict specific. And so, I kind of think of there as being two kinds of data on conflict that are very useful. One is data that's derived from press reports. And for that, there are a couple of these organizations. ACLID, UCDP is another one. GDELT, the Global Data on Event Language and Tone, does its own version of this. Janes has a version of event data. And there, what you're getting the violence that's reported on. So that's one kind of data on violence. And it's very useful, but there are all kinds of biases that the reporting process introduces. So the other kind of data you want is administratively collected data that's developed by the organizations that are engaged in the conflict. So for militaries, this is like the data on the events and when their units are in contact. For police organizations, it's certain kinds of data on when they're getting calls or when they're reporting crimes. And you often want to triage between these. What we found in a number of places is that the press data are generally right on the trends, but radically underreport the amount of conflict that's going on. And so if you see something in the press data, it's almost surely really there. But there are a lot of things you can learn with that locally generated administrative data that you can't find in the press data. And so when you look at that administrative data, the process for creating that is very different in each place because different organizations approach it differently. And part of that subject matter knowledge that I mentioned that you need is to be able to talk to the people who built those data and understand why did things get in, how did the data collection change over time, what are the biases in it. And getting that requires being able to form relationships and go in and understand really the day-to-day of the people who built out the data.
Yeah, one thing that I remember being, I guess, impressed upon the first time I ran across the book Small Wars, Big Data was the point you made about non-combatants having data about or having insights or information about insurgent groups. What is it? I mean, it doesn't sound like this is the type of data you're talking about there, but I guess that was, at least in that context, which was some of these, I guess we might at one point call them non-state actors, but are kind of, is that data equally important in each of the contexts, or is that really very specific to those intrastate conflicts that you write about in Small Wars, Big Data? I'm just kind of trying to figure out, like, is that very generalizable, or is that like something, because you didn't mention that in the types of data that would be important.
So there are a couple different things going on there. One is like, what is the information that exists in the population about what's going on? And often the people, almost always in fact, the people in the middle of the fighting, their life and livelihoods depend on understanding what's going on, being able to anticipate how things are going to be in their local area in the next week and the next month and so on. So they're very motivated to pay attention and watch what's happening. So they have to know a lot about what's happening, and then they adjust their behavior in response. And so part of the point in Small Wars, Big Data is that when you think about the strategies of government and rebel groups in these conflicts where there is a huge disparity in military power. So if the government knows where the rebels or terrorists are going to be at a given point in time, they can act on them. Then what the civilians do with the information that they have becomes the critical constraint on violence. And both sides take that into account. if you're thinking about how do you measure what's going on in different conflicts, what the fact that people know so much means is their behavior is going to reflect lots of things about how they expect the conflict to go. So if you suddenly observe people not going to market on a day when the market is normally busy, probably means they're expecting some kind of instability in the very near future. And so they're staying home. So it creates all kinds of signals that you can observe and measure.
Yeah. I mean, that's interesting and kind of is related to another point. If maybe I took this from someone else, but some things like the battle in these conflicts isn't necessarily over territory, but it's over the people themselves in this because of the source of information they might have, or they might share something they don't want them to share on it, such that like the ties that they're trying to create with both entities, on whether it's the state actor against the non-state actor. I mean, do you think that still holds? I mean, I guess is that something you guys argue in that book, I guess, or did I take that from someone else?
No, I mean, so the idea that the people are what gets fought over has long been part of the rhetoric around insurgency and civil war. In our book, what we basically point out is that it's not necessarily the willingness of people to go up and pick up a gun and fight or give money that matters. The ability to do the much easier task of sharing a little bit of information can be very consequential when there's this big gap in military capacity between the two sides. And that decision is one that's influenced by ideology, but by many other things too. And so, if the government can start to win people to the view that it's the better party to be in control, they may still decide not to share information because they're at risk of retribution if they do. But it'll take a smaller piece of motivation to get them to share. So that's kind of first distinction. The second, though, is the story that we tell in the book is not one about mass sentiment. It's about the people who are right on the border between being willing to share information or not, and how you get a few more of them to flip sides. That's not like winning the population over in the traditional sense. It's making these small changes. And, in thinking about this, we want to be really careful because this is a theory and set of arguments about what it takes to for the government to control a given village or a valley. That is a very different question than what it takes to get a favorable political settlement. Right?
Yeah.
For that, you need to go back to, kind of older ideas about the conditions under which political parties and political entities are going to be willing to make deals with each other and resolve their conflicts.
How do we understand that from afar? What are the ways that we would try to capture those maybe underlying dynamics right now? Of course, there is an obvious answer of go there and ask them on it. But let's say that's not possible for people. What are the other routes to getting insight into those underlying drivers of it, from positions like sitting at Filter Lab's office in Cambridge, Mass, or the Princeton University? How would we do that?
I think there are a few things you can think about. One is people now are more accessible to talk than they were before. There's all kinds of secure ways for people to get out and communicate, and they have strong incentives to do so. Right? Mostly political organizations want to get their story out. And I'm like constantly amazed by the level of detail people who just take a little bit of time to build relationships are able to get out of all kinds of organizations that are involved in conflict. That's the first thing is like, you do get out and talk to them, but you leverage technology to do it in ways that are safe and let you get time with people who are in very difficult situations that historically you couldn't get. Second thing is, you think about what are the things where their behavior reflects some forward-looking anticipation of how things are going to go. So if you see people taking certain travel routes or avoiding certain travel routes, that tells you something about where they feel safe or not. And therefore what they understand to be the local politics of the situation. But I don't think any of that works without some significant dose of knowledge of people who understand the local place and context. We often set up this dichotomy between you can use the data or you can use the subject matter knowledge. Like they're substitutes. And in fact, they're complements in developing knowledge. The better you understand the local politics, the smarter you can be about how to use data to generate further knowledge about those local politics.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that because that's actually something that like we've thought a lot about
Mm-hmm.
is how to put subject matter experts into the like data discovery, data analysis, and then like in product. Which is kind of sometimes feels like there's this data team. They're supposed to go get data. They hand it over to the subject matter expert. And the subject matter expert like adds their extra insight into it, and then it goes off. And often subject matter experts look at the data they've been given, and this is all the wrong data, and trying to like put it together. But it's really complicated there because there is quite frankly sometimes a skill gap on the subject matter expert not really knowing enough about like where like data availability and how to get access to it in a timely way and setting up data pipelines on it that are all like the nuts and bolts of this. And that's really hard. And so like how do you think? I mean, I guess it's kind of just like seeking your advice a little bit. Like how would you do that? Put a subject matter expert and like a great data engineering team together. If you had like no limits on it.
Yeah, so let me respond with a story, which is, I know, kind of unsatisfying, but the story is of a recent paper that I have coming out with Anouk Drink, Tarek Ghani, and Juan Lozano that looks at the relationship between minerals extraction and conflict in Africa. And this project started out with a really simple observation, which is that a lot of the mineral-related conflict in Africa is happening in places where there are no rebels. So it can't be about someone trying to capture the rents from owning a mine or controlling the trade to and from it. It has to be something else. So it was an observation that came from a little bit of data analysis with ACLID. We then talked to colleagues at the International Crisis Group. We were at the time running a fellowship program with them, and we asked them to visit a number of mine sites where there had been conflict and ones where it seemed like there could have been, but there wasn't, to learn about the local political dynamics. And we heard a range of stories about conflict between industrial miners and artisanal miners who wanted to work the same territory that were sometimes managed through negotiations and sometimes broke into conflict. That then inspired a round of data analysis where we went and we started to look at what happens when mineral prices go up or down, how much of the increase in conflict when they go up is happening at places where you have both artisanal mining and traditional mining. And it looked like there was a pattern. So then we went back to the crisis group team and said, hey, could you go to these 6 mines? The data suggested to us were kind of on the boundary in interesting ways, and ask them to get more information on the local politics. And so they did, and we got more stories, and that made us realize we needed a way to measure the potential for artisanal mining across the continent, because oftentimes smart mine owners would reach a deal with potential artisanal miners to pay them off ahead of time to not come on to the tenure and try to mine, because that was a business cost. And so that meant if you just looked where there was artisanal mining, you weren't measuring the right thing. And so that then led us to this whole complicated machine learning process to take geological data and predict suitability for artisanal mining across the whole continent, that we could then come out with an estimate that said, roughly 35 to 45% of the mining-related conflict in Africa is not about predation. It's not about rent seeking. It's about the fight between people who want to mine artisanally and the industrial mine owners, and the breakdown of political bargains for them to share rents. So that process was like a regular interaction between the data analytics team and the people who are on the ground trying to understand conflict in the kind of traditional qualitative ways. Got us to some insights that neither of us could have gotten on our own, but we had to iterate a few times through that cycle of data, local evidence, data, local evidence, and then finally data analysis.
Yeah, that strikes me as that's right. And I did something similar in an academic context with trying to figure out like violent religious groups in and around Lahore, Pakistan. And that was really helpful there. And I guess what we're trying to like go through, particularly if you could do like on-sites, you could figure out, you could like meet some of the people there. That was really helpful to like putting this and trying to figure out what's a significant indicator for the group, which is really like important to like keep track of throughout it. And because they're going to be, it's going to vary from even group to group within even something that we might bucket as largely very similar types of group structures, ideologies, and locations on it. And I guess one thing that we've been kind of like working through is kind of standardizing the process that we might be able to replicate that data that is always going to be a reduction on something, because that's what data is. And that in-person interaction, but with from afar, and trying to like replicate that has really been I think if insofar that we've done things like really well is when we do that really well right now. And it's getting that. And I think it has some, a lot to do with subject matter experts, not only like advising on where data is, but being part of the collection, like being willing to actually like roll up their sleeves and do something that sometimes they think is kind of below them on it, which is like maybe a little bit of a sensitive subject if some of them are listening to it, to this.
I mean, I think that one runs both ways. Like I kind of think of if you think about subject matter expertise and data, there's some connective tissue you want between them.
Yeah.
And I tend to think of social science as that connective tissue. Someone who can take a set of very specific questions and ideas from the subject matter experts, abstract them to something general that can be measured, and then communicate with the data science team or data analytics team to figure out how you measure the quantities that are the general representations of the specific thing that the SMEs were talking about. And, so if you're asking kind of like what the core value is that I think an organization like yours wants, there's some data engineering and some network of SMEs, but in between, I would think you would want a number of people who've developed the kind of intuition for how to scientifically approach a range of questions with data.
Yeah, I was actually just talking to Gary King. He's the director of the Institute for Quantitative Social Science at Harvard, where I have an appointment, about like the need to actually encourage social scientists with that kind of expertise to enter the space here. His big interest is trying to like energize a little bit more entrepreneurship in the social sciences, which has been like there's a lot of the natural sciences, and basically if you do anything at Harvard, there's like an office of like commercialization that's there. They know every study that's going on. It's like it's not the case in the social sciences. Like we do a lot of stuff in that context that like is really cool and helpful. And in some sense, like this is what we're aiming to do, but there's not like really great models for it, I've realized, on it, because because there's just not a lot of social scientists that make their way into the context, at least in like the technology sector on it. But I think it's the most promising like ligature of the two.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I've been part of the push on campus here for a number of years to encourage and support entrepreneurial activity. And one of the things I've observed here, being part of it's called the Keller Center, is our Center on Entrepreneurial Education. And then we have a number of other institutions we've set up to help faculty and graduate student and other kind of within the Princeton community entrepreneurs, is in the natural sciences for many kinds of inventions. There's a fairly replicable path to commercialization. And it starts with locking down the IP and then instantiating it in something that could be sold in some manner, and then building out a team around that product. Oftentimes, the social science insights don't have that clear revenue model behind them. They don't have that well-trodden path to commercialization. So the weight on the faculty who've come up with something to translate the thing they have learned doing their science into a commercializable product, that road is often much longer and more uncertain. And so faculty thinking about taking that entrepreneurial leap have, in some ways, a bigger gap to cross than the natural scientists. And one, importantly, that's harder to do in the 1 day a week the university gives you for non-university business. So I think some of it is just that, like, by the nature of the products you can generate from social science research, there's not as clear a commercialization path.
Yeah, and that's also what drives that. Like, I think the majority of them that do go into offering some kind of something commercially is into a consulting model,
Right.
like a services model, which obviously those aren't the big companies, with very few exceptions, we talk about. We talk normally about fairly like scalable companies there because they're creating value, for many people. And so there are some, I think, there's some people who do have like scalable ideas, but they sometimes underestimate how much work it is to even get a scalable idea off the ground that's really good, well tested, and all of that. And such that, like, there's I find that there's often this instinct of like, oh, let me just go find a business person to take over this and then it'll work, sort of thing. And there's like, they don't adequately realize that, at least in like social scientific related things, you are really reliant on the original founder, or the guy with the idea, with the intellectual property, properly speaking, to sell it on like a day-to-day basis, which I guess this goes back to the 1 day a week problem.
1,000%. I mean, and I think there's this category of things you learn in social science that could have real meaning for policy, that require a sustained advocacy and commercial and productization effort, but that don't have a commercial payoff at the end. And the only university I can think of that's really cracked the code on how to do that is Stanford, with the Stanford Innovation Labs. And there they have a structured process to take faculty who want to turn their research ideas into policy impact through a number of stages for how to think about that, how to learn to tell the story, and then getting them some support to tell the story and try and scale it. But that's been, it was like basically a 5-year journey for Stanford to figure out how to do that, to put it in place, and then to raise the endowment that sustains it and makes it a resource for people across the campus. It'd be great if more universities did that.
What are some of their successes there? I mean, if you can recall, sorry to put you on the spot here. We didn't plan to talk about this at all.
No, I did not come prepared to talk about this at all. So the ones I can think of are some of the ones that motivated SIL in the first place. And a lot of those were things like experiments around dynamic assignment algorithms for resettling refugees, that Jens Heinmuller and David Layton and Jeremy Weinstein worked on, that then, I'm actually not sure if Jeremy was on that project or just advising it, that then were put into practice and turned out to lead to much better integration outcomes for the refugees. And then they worked to get those algorithms more widely adopted by the resettlement agencies to improve refugee welfare. So that was one of the things that was like a study that motivated the idea for SIL. I don't actually know if it was run eventually through SIL or not.
Yeah.
So next time you have me on, I'll come prepared to talk about someone else's project.
No, well, let's talk about well, we'll get back to your project and research here, but just like really interested in double clicking on this for some reason right now. Maybe it's more like just like personal anxiety on it, about trying to, like, I keep up an academic career and I run a company, and like that's something I'm always interested in. So, but
it's a lot. But I mean, let me pick up on one aspect of this, which is, my university and many others have what I think of as a fundamental moral problem, which is because of our tax-exempt status, we literally sit on perpetual money machines. Right? If you can trade without capital gains taxes, you should be able to beat the market year in, year out. And what that means is that we're at the point now as a university where we do not serve enough students given the value of our endowment and the payout. So as an institution, we need to figure out how to do more for the world long term, and that problem's only going to grow. And as more universities develop really good endowment management organizations and the returns compound over time, they're going to be entering a similar situation. That's potentially a massive source for good for the world. And if you have these institutions that have resources to connect the latest and greatest research in many fields to practical applications. But they need to set up structures to do that. And historically, that wasn't so important, but as now, all the major universities have developed fundraising systems and are getting those endowment management teams together, they're all going to start to move into the space we're in where it is a moral imperative.
Yeah.
And so I think more universities do need to figure out how to leverage for the betterment of the world the insights that are being developed by their faculty. Some of that is going to be commercialization, but I think a lot of it will be things that are not commercial, but are bringing more quickly into the policy world the things that we're learning in research and education, public health, social sciences, et cetera.
Yeah, there seems to be. I think you're right, and you saying that actually kind of really confirms some of these thoughts I've had over the years of kind of looking at the university where I've largely had a very comfortable professional life, and then in the kind of for-profit technology startup space of that, there's a lot there. They have a lot of resources. It's very poorly allocated at times, or it's allocated according to a different logic, we might say, and which they should rightly allocate differently from the ways that companies do. But I guess I'm kind of thinking a little bit around how do you get these universities to start to do something that is really broadly available and also has huge take up? Because I think about some of these university programs to track mis and disinformation. They're not actually the ones that are the dominantly used ones out there. People go to commercially available ones. And I think there is something that commercial offerings do that's better is they have to get to a better product much faster on it, and they learn something better. I'm kind of thinking about universities have the resources, they have the people, they would even have the ability to pursue a social good, beyond the conditions that a for-profit company can, but they very rarely seem to pull off a really good product at the end. And I'm that's and maybe you disagree about that, which is fine. I mean, you can push back against it, but it's just don't see the product refinement working. It's just the pressure cooker of the for-profit does help to some extent. If you could add that element in, I could see your big vision being really attractive. But I don't know how to add that element in without ruining the good things.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are many different ways that universities can generate real world impact. Some of those are through kind of fostering and enabling innovation and ventures that grow up and out, but others are about developing and then maintaining systems to provide situational awareness for the rest of society on what is happening, in the society. An example I like to think about a lot is the formation of reliable unemployment measures.
Mm-hmm.
Those go back to a policy debate in the 1950s and the National Bureau of Economic Research taking on the mission of figuring out how do we consistently measure what the unemployment rate is in society. That's a super simple number, but measuring it reliably is useful across the economy. There's not a killer product in it, but it's a thing that improves welfare in this little way in 1,000 tiny ways every day. Maybe not every day, maybe every month.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that's comes to mind, and other people have been talking about this for a while, is some of the problems within a lot of this kind of the bias, what's popularly conceived as the bias issue within LLMs or some of these, is a lot of it is just the corpus itself. The training corpus wasn't high quality, but it's really expensive to do that. It's very time consuming. Thinking but universities do sit on a lot of assets, and they could provide that a very good corpus for other people to come in on. And but it's not sexy, right? It's it's the boring stuff of what really makes the this kind of what we're now calling AI industry work is just the boring work of making sure you have a really good corpus of data to be trained on.
Yeah, I mean, that's one example. Another one in the AI space would be, there are dozens of papers that measure the performance and bias of different systems for different tasks. A university or coalition of universities that got together and created an AI bias observatory could take the code that has been written for several of those, make it more efficient, scalable, parallelizable, run it securely, establish partnerships with the different AI companies to audit their systems, or with consumers to see how they're interacting with the systems, and generate for the country and the world some standardized measures of how these systems are working and how their use is evolving in the way that we have for, say, the natural physical environment. It's a thing many universities could afford to do that would be a massive public good that would build on faculty research in various ways. So there are, those kinds of public goods looking activities, this kind of public goods provision activities, that it would be great to see more of. They're entrepreneurial, but not in the sense of like leading to a for-profit product.
Yeah. Yeah, they could, they could actually level the playing field a lot and make the market here actually more competitive as well.
Potentially, yeah.
And but let's switch back for a second. Let's go back to what you planned on talking about. And I actually kind of I'd love, and I guess obviously things going in Syria, and the fall of Assad, and I guess it kind of felt like this was a great time to talk to Jake Shapiro about this, and maybe other people, and you're tired of talking about it already, but there was this. I guess I was thinking about something, and correct me if I'm wrong, about this thing that I remember in Terrorist Dilemma, about your first book, I think it was in 2013, about how the for a group out there, and if I recall rightly, it was about like a subnational group there. For it to win political power, it really wasn't about the strength of its violence, but it was like about its ability to get like large scale political mobilization there. And I was actually kind of like, it kind of was connecting some dots that I was thinking about like the asymmetry of power within these conflicts. And often, these people become, their route is through becoming a political party, like established somehow, and then growing it that way. But like what we kind of have seen to some extent in Syria is an actual like rebellion that was over a long period of time. Eventually, I guess, like, and the violence that we saw over the last week of the Assad regime wasn't like spectacular. It wasn't, they didn't come in with this show of force. It was like obviously Iran and Russia not being able, and Iran kind of pulling out pretty quickly, was like, was an earth-shattering kind of like shift in the region that we haven't seen, the longest running military partnership in the region. And for that to like just evaporate overnight, and obviously Russia with it, I was just like, so I kept coming back to that, thinking about like this one group, which Syria designated as a terrorist group. I believe, maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, I think we had declared it
HTS
one.
is a specially designated global terrorist group.
Like they had ties with the Islamic State. And how do you account for their toppling Assad here? And I was trying to like think back to like the frameworks you've provided in the past. I couldn't find one that really fit. But maybe you think of one that I overlooked.
Well, so I think to understand the collapse of the Assad regime, the best thing to go back to is the fall of the Berlin Wall. And Susan Lohman at Carnegie Mellon has this brilliant paper on the Monday demonstrations in Leipzig. These were these demonstrations in Leipzig, Germany, that grew massively over one summer and precipitated in many ways the fall of the Berlin Wall, which was an unexpected outcome. And part of the explanation for this is, Timur Kran's idea of preference falsification. Many, many people in East Germany hated the regime and wanted to see it fall, but no one knew how many other people hated the regime and wanted to see it fall, because to say you hated the regime and wanted to see it fall was to run afoul of the Stasi and end up in prison.
Mm-hmm.
And so the population's attitudes were shifting and shifting and shifting, and then you needed an event that would convince people, help them learn this information they didn't know, which is how much everyone else hated the government. And the Monday demonstrations provided that information. And then at one point, you got a sudden cascade into hundreds of thousands of people participating. The weakness of the regime became apparent, and the Berlin Wall fell. So if you think about what happened in Syria, the big issue there, I think, was preference falsification. Everyone, there's no uncertainty that many, many people wanted the regime gone. But there was a lot of uncertainty about how strong it was. And you could see this even a month ago with Assad starting to be reintegrated into the Arab League. I think the other governments didn't know how weak he was. But surely tens of thousands of people around Syria knew how weak the regime was. But no one was going to talk about how weak the regime was because they didn't know for sure that their information was general. It might just be their little bit of it that was hollowed out and weak. And so you didn't get people acting on it, not because the regime wasn't weak, but because no one knew that all these other people knew the regime was weak. And so the way HTS kind of triggers the collapse of the regime is they initiate this offensive just 2 weeks ago. And the first units they come into contact with crumble. And all of a sudden, everyone in the regime and all the civilians is looking around going, that thing that I saw locally, maybe that's more widespread than I thought. And the advance continues and more units crumble. And Iran and Russia look at it and decide it's not a good bet. And now everyone knows that the regime is hollow. And so no one's willing to fight for it, and the whole thing collapses in a very quick way. And the fundamental problem there was that, people didn't know that the thing they were observing locally was a thing that was across the whole country. But when HTS creates that knowledge with its offensive, then the thing falls apart very quickly. It's like if you built a sandcastle and you've let it dry out, and it appears to be very stable and solid, but then you poke the bottom of it and the whole thing falls apart because now it's just dry sand. It's kind of what HTS did. So they didn't win in the sense of bulldozing their way across the beach.
Yeah.
They won in the sense of taking this action that revealed the weakness of the government.
So we're at the end of our time here, but what's the next country to experience that?
If I were a betting person, I would bet on Russia being very close to losing the ability to sustain the fight in Syria. Russia being let me say that again. I would bet on Russia being very close to losing the ability to sustain the fight in Ukraine.
Yeah, I think that they didn't defend having such a very important naval base there. In Assad's family, the Alawite quarter of Syria, it's highly, that's something they definitely wanted to keep. They don't want to give that up. And putting that at risk shows that there's real stress there in the military, if also importing North Korean soldiers wasn't enough.
And the apparent inability to get inflation under control, the significant accident rate in their civil aviation. There are all these kind of markers of a government that's really not capable of doing the job it's set out to do. I don't know what the triggering event is that leads them to sue for peace. And they do have an easy way out, which is they can negotiate a settlement of the war in Ukraine.
Yeah.
So I don't think we'll see the Russian government fall, but it wouldn't surprise me if there was a sudden move towards peace talks in the next few months, especially with today's news that $20 billion of seized assets have been passed to Ukraine. That creates some staying power for Ukraine that wouldn't have been there previously.
Yeah, I mean, everyone that we talk to on this issue, and this is probably the one issue that we do the most work in, is looking for some kind of settlement, whether that's people who think the Trump effect will have it, but there's also internal dynamics within both Ukraine and Russia that a lot of the kind of, for better or worse, what we would call the Soviet stockpile there has been depleted. And it's very, very hard to really get enough of it to sustain this. And that's on both sides. So On that somber note, I guess we're going to end here.
Well, you can edit it to put the happier stuff
So
at the
happy the
end.
stuff at the
That's
end.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's been a real pleasure here, and thank you. I feel like the conversation just like only got started to some extent, and there was more to talk about. But maybe we can continue the conversation another time.
Absolutely. Jonathan, thank you for the chance to talk today.
Yeah, well, thanks a lot for joining us, and everyone. If you ever want to find, or how do they find like what you're working on, your papers? I guess you have your website, but are you active on X as they call it?
I am not. I'm on LinkedIn, and I'm on a new platform called Spread, but that's not a place to find my work. That's where it's a place to share the things you're reading and find informative. So those are
Oh, cool.
the two social platforms I spend time on. But I find for professional conversations, LinkedIn is actually very good. And for anyone interested in what's next on Syria, I strongly recommend Ben Conable has a wonderful short piece, takes about 5 minutes to read, on what's next in Syria. And it's an excellent précis on how we got here and where things might go next.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us. This has been really wonderful.
Thanks, Jonathan. We'll talk to you soon.
So.